He thought I was asleep in the back seat. That was his first mistake. Through the narrow slit of my eyes, I watched my husband check the rearview mirror, wipe away the tears he had shed in front of the doctor, and smile. Not a nervous smile. It was the quiet, satisfied smile of a man who believed a locked door had finally opened. Then Daniel looked at his watch. 7 days, he whispered. A moment later, he called his daughter and said, "Don't do anything until there's a death certificate." What he did not know was that 1 month earlier, I had already removed his name as the beneficiary of the one policy he was counting on most. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 57 that fall, and before the week I collapsed, I believed the worst thing that could happen to me was growing old alone. I had already survived one marriage that ended in silence and resentment. When I met Daniel 8 years later, he seemed like the opposite of everything I had escaped. He listened when I spoke. He remembered small things. He made coffee before I woke up and warmed my car on cold mornings. I mistook steadiness for loyalty because I wanted to. I owned a small property restoration company in Asheville, North Carolina. I had started Carter Property Restoration 16 years before I met Daniel first, from a folding desk in a rented office, then from a real building with my name on the glass. Daniel had never worked for the company. He attended holiday dinners and accepted compliments from clients, but he had never negotiated a contract-covered payroll during a bad month, or stood inside a storm-damaged home promising a frightened family that we would make it livable again. Our pre-nuptial agreement kept the company, my house, and the greenhouse behind it as my separate property. Daniel had signed that agreement with a smile. The trouble began quietly. I was tired all the time. I lost 11 pounds without trying. A dull ache beneath my right ribs became a sharper pain that sometimes left me leaning against the kitchen counter until it passed. I blamed work, then stress, then age. One Tuesday morning I stood up from my desk, reached toward Ruth's filing cabinet, and woke several hours later beneath hospital lights. The doctors kept me overnight. They started intravenous antibiotics, monitored my blood pressure, and ran imaging that showed an abnormal area near my liver and gallbladder, along with a serious infection. The scans were concerning but not conclusive. The doctors said they needed additional testing, and warned that if the infection failed to respond, my condition could decline quickly. Daniel leaned forward in the chair beside my bed. "How quickly?" "I can't give you an exact timeline," the doctor said. "A week." The doctor never said 7 days. Daniel did. And once he said it, he treated it like a promise. In front of the doctor and the nurse adjusting my IV, Daniel took my hand and cried. His shoulders shook. He pressed my fingers against his mouth. "I don't know how I'll live without you." For one weak moment I believed him. Fear can make you reach for comfort, even when that comfort has already begun to feel dangerous. By the next afternoon, my fever had come down and my blood pressure had stabilized. The hospital discharged me with antibiotics, strict instructions, and an appointment for further testing within days. I was too weak to sit upright for the drive home, so Daniel helped me into the back seat and tucked a hospital blanket around my legs. He thought I fell asleep before we left the parking garage. I kept my eyes nearly closed and watched him through the gap between my lashes. He checked the mirror twice. Then he wiped his face and smiled. It was not the kind of smile people give when someone they love survives a frightening night. It was small, private, and relieved. He looked at his watch. 7 days, he whispered. Then he called Megan. Her voice came through the car speakers. "What did they say?" "Days," Daniel replied. "Maybe a week." There was a short pause. "What about the house?" "Not now. And the insurance?" Daniel lowered his voice, though the call was still playing through the speakers. "Don't do anything until there's a death certificate. After that, everything moves fast." My fingers went numb around the edge of the blanket, but I kept my breathing slow and even. If Daniel looked into the mirror and saw my eyes open, the conversation would stop. Megan asked about the business. "We'll deal with that after the paperwork clears," he said. I watched the concrete walls of the parking garage slide past the window. I had slept beside that man for 8 years. I had trusted him with the alarm code, the keys to my home, and the names of every person I would call in an emergency. Now he was discussing my death as though it were a closing date. I was not entirely surprised. 1 month earlier, I had found an email Daniel sent to our insurance agent from the laptop we used for household bills. He asked how long a life insurance claim usually took after a spouse died, and whether a beneficiary could receive an advance before probate. When I confronted him, he said he was planning responsibly because we were getting older. That same week, I found a credit card statement hidden beneath old tax folders. $42,000 in charges I did not recognize. Hotel stays, cash advances, expensive dinners, and payments to a private lender. Daniel admitted the debt but called it a temporary mistake from a failed real estate deal. I did not yell. I called Claire Whitmore, the attorney who had handled my company documents for years. Claire reviewed my estate plan. I changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy from Daniel to a revocable trust. At that point, I had not decided exactly how every dollar would eventually be used. I only knew I no longer wanted Daniel controlling it. Claire also tightened the protections around my company and house. She made sure every lawful marital claim remained accounted for. I was not hiding assets. I was protecting decisions that should never have been his to make alone. At the time, I told myself I was simply being cautious. In the back seat of that car, listening to my husband count down the days until my death, I understood I had not been cautious soon enough. When we reached home, Daniel guided me to the couch with a tenderness that would have fooled anyone watching. He brought me water, arranged the pillows behind my back, and checked my medication schedule twice. Then he stepped onto the porch with his phone. For 8 years, Daniel had been the first person I called whenever something frightened me. That afternoon, he was the person I was hiding from. The moment the door closed, I reached beneath the blanket and texted Ruth Delgado, my office manager and closest friend of 22 years. "Do not call me. Come to the greenhouse at 6 tomorrow morning. Bring the office keys." I deleted the message and placed the phone beneath the blanket. Daniel believed 7 days stood between him and everything I owned. Before his countdown ended, I intended to learn exactly what he had already put in motion, and how much of my life he believed was his to claim. That was day 1. Ruth arrived before sunrise, carrying a paper grocery bag in one hand and a small toolbox in the other. From the kitchen window, she would look like a woman dropping off soup and checking the greenhouse irrigation, which was exactly what she planned to say if Daniel woke early. He did not. The house was still dark when I slipped out the back door in my robe and coat. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold soil. Ruth was waiting beside the greenhouse, her gray hair pulled into a loose knot, her mouth already set in the hard lines she wore whenever a contractor tried to charge us twice for the same work. She took one look at me and whispered, "You look awful." "Good morning to you too." She opened the greenhouse door and helped me inside. The old structure had belonged to my mother before it belonged to me. She taught me how to root cuttings at the long wooden table beneath the east windows. Years later, after my first marriage ended, I sat at that same table with a legal pad and wrote the first business plan for Carter Property Restoration. Daniel called the greenhouse clutter. My mother had called it proof that damaged things could grow again. Ruth set the grocery bag on the table. "Tell me everything." I told her about the doctor, the parking garage, Daniel's smile, and the call to Megan. I repeated his exact words about the death certificate. By the time I finished, Ruth's fingers were curled around the edge of the table. "I'm going to need 5 minutes alone with him." "No, I need you angry later. Right now I need you useful." Her mouth tightened, but she nodded. "There's something you should know," she said. 3 days before I collapsed, Daniel had visited the office while I was meeting a client across town. He told Ruth he wanted to understand what would happen if my health got worse. He asked who could sign company checks if you were incapacitated, she said. Then he asked whether a spouse automatically inherited ownership. When I told him the company was protected under your prenup, he asked how fast it could be sold. I lowered myself onto an old stool. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because he sounded worried, and because you'd been sick for weeks and refusing to admit it." Her voice softened. "I thought he was trying to prepare. So did I." Ruth covered my hand with hers. "What do you need?" "The office keys, copies of anything he requested, and watch the accounts without changing anything yet." "You think he already has access?" "I don't know." That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Daniel had lived in my house for 8 years. He knew where I kept tax returns, insurance statements, passwords, and spare keys. Trust gives people access long before paperwork does. We returned to the kitchen separately. Ruth came through the side door 5 minutes after me and called out brightly, "I brought chicken soup and checked the greenhouse valve." Daniel entered wearing pressed slacks and a blue sweater, freshly showered, carrying a manila folder. "You didn't have to come this early," he told her. Ruth smiled. "Evelyn signs my checks. I'm motivated." He laughed, but his eyes stayed on her a moment too long. By the second morning of Daniel's countdown, half the neighborhood already believed I was dying. He had posted a photograph of our hands together with a message about faith, courage, and making every day count. He had called Pastor Lewis and asked whether the church could organize a prayer gathering at our house. He had spoken to people I had not yet told myself. After Ruth left, Daniel made oatmeal and measured out my medication. When my hands shook, he cut my toast into smaller pieces. For several minutes, I saw the man I thought I had married. Then he placed the folder beside my bowl. I put together a few routine documents, he said. Nothing dramatic, just so I can help if you get weaker. The first page was a medical authorization. The second was a limited financial power of attorney. On the surface, both looked ordinary. Then I reached the attached schedule. The language was broader there. It would allow Daniel to communicate with banks, insurers, and any business entity in which I held an ownership interest. It did not say Carter Property Restoration by name. It did not need to. You did all this overnight. I couldn't sleep. Who prepared it? A legal website. It's standard. I want Claire to review it. His hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. Claire makes everything complicated. She makes things legal. We're married, Evelyn. That's exactly why you won't mind her reading it. His smile stayed in place, but the muscles around it tightened. He closed the folder slowly. You're exhausted. We can talk later. He carried the papers away. That night, my fever rose. Daniel sat beside the bed with a damp cloth and helped me drink water. His face looked tired. When I woke near midnight, he was still there, slumped in the chair with his arms folded. For a moment, I wondered whether I had misunderstood him, whether the parking lot had been panic, whether fear had twisted his words into something uglier than he meant. Then he opened his eyes. Do the pills make you foggy? Sometimes. How foggy? The question stayed with me longer than the fever did. On the third day, Megan arrived carrying a casserole in a foil pan with a grocery store label still stuck to the bottom. She kissed my cheek, told me I looked strong, and spent several minutes photographing the dining room antiques. Dad said you wanted to make sure the family pieces were documented, she explained. I never said that. Her phone lowered by an inch. I'm just helping. Later, I found her in the hallway looking toward the office. Dad said you were giving away the company, she said. Daniel appeared behind her, but she continued. He said you wanted to leave everything to employees and people who aren't family. I built that company 16 years before I met your father. He still supported you. Daniel had attended holiday parties and accepted compliments from clients. He had never repaired a roof, negotiated a contract, or covered payroll during a bad quarter. He enjoyed the income, I said. That is not the same as building the business. Megan's face hardened. After she left, I went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and called Claire. She confirmed the beneficiary change was active. She also reminded me that the prenuptial agreement kept the house and company separate. You are not hiding assets, she said. You are protecting control. Then her voice changed. If Daniel convinces anyone you lack capacity, he can create delays and expense. Ask your doctor to document that you are alert-oriented and capable of making decisions. Do not sign anything without me present. That afternoon, my doctor added the note to my record. When I returned home, Daniel announced that he had arranged a consultation with an in-home hospice coordinator. I don't have a final diagnosis, I said. It's only a consultation. I am still pursuing treatment. He looked at me with practiced sadness. Sometimes hope only prolongs suffering. Later, I called the coordinator myself. Daniel had told her my specialist believed I was terminal. That was not true. That evening, the printer stopped halfway through a job because it had run out of paper. One page remained in the tray. The subject line read, Estimated Net Proceeds After Sale of Residence. Below it was a proposed listing range for my house and a note suggesting the greenhouse could be removed to improve the backyard. I stood there holding the page while Daniel spoke softly on the porch, telling someone how bravely he was preparing to lose me. By the end of day 3, he had already begun spending a life I had not left. He was not preparing for my death. He was preparing to profit from it. On the 4th morning of Daniel's countdown, Ruth arranged the second opinion through my family doctor, who sent the scans and hospital records directly to Duke University Hospital. That mattered. I wanted the next decision to come through my own medical team, not through Claire, not through Daniel, and not through some private clinic he could later accuse me of choosing, because it told me what I wanted to hear. The specialist called before noon. His name was Dr. Nathan Hall, and he spoke with the steady patience of someone who knew frightened people often needed to hear the same truth more than once. I reviewed the imaging and the blood work, he said. There is an abnormal area near the liver, but I would not call this terminal cancer based on what I've seen. I sat straighter against the pillows. What would you call it? Possibly a liver abscess caused by an infected bile duct, or a complication involving the gallbladder. It can be dangerous, especially if the infection spreads, but it may be treatable. You need drainage cultures and a biopsy before anyone makes a final diagnosis. Daniel stood near the bedroom window with his arms folded. I just don't want her chasing painful procedures because she's afraid to accept what the first doctor said. Dr. Hall paused. The first doctor did not make a terminal diagnosis. Daniel looked at me. You know what I mean. I'm not chasing hope, I said. I'm asking for a diagnosis. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Dr. Hall said she should be admitted today. After the call ended, Daniel stared at the dark screen as though it had personally betrayed him. You really want to go back to the hospital? I want to know what is happening in my body. You're scared. I am. That does not make me confused. He drove me to Durham with the radio off. His hand stayed fixed on the wheel. He asked once whether I had brought my insurance card, then said nothing for the rest of the trip. While we waited in the admissions area, his phone lit up on the chair between us. Megan had written, "What if she recovers?" Daniel answered before he noticed me looking. First doctor said days. Don't panic. I turned my face toward the window. That afternoon, a radiologist drained the infected pocket near my liver and sent samples for testing. The procedure left me sore and exhausted, but the pressure beneath my ribs eased for the first time in weeks. I spent the night connected to antibiotics while Daniel sat beside the bed scrolling through his phone and lifting his head whenever a nurse entered. At one point, he asked whether the medication could affect judgment. He did not ask whether it was controlling the pain. The biopsy results came back on day 5. There was no evidence of malignancy. The infection had started in a blocked bile duct and spread into a liver abscess. It was serious. Left untreated, it could have killed me. But with drainage, antibiotics, and surgery once the infection settled, the doctors expected me to recover. Dr. Hall sat beside the bed while he explained it. You have work ahead of you, he said, but you are not terminal. My hands began to shake. For 8 years, Daniel had been the first person I called when something good happened. A signed contract, a clean scan after an old health scare, a quiet little victory at work that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to me. Now a doctor had just handed me my life back, and my husband was the one person I could not tell. The realization hurt more than the incision beneath my ribs. I thought of the greenhouse, the company, Ruth, and all the mornings I had assumed would keep arriving because they always had. Then I thought of Daniel smiling into the rearview mirror. Claire came to the hospital that evening. Ruth arrived shortly afterward with clean clothes and a paper cup of coffee I was not allowed to drink. Daniel had gone home to shower. I want to tell him I said, tonight. Claire placed her briefcase on the chair. If you confront him now, he will say he misunderstood the first doctor. He will destroy documents, change passwords, and start building a story about your mental state. I am tired of pretending. This is not about revenge. It is about making sure he cannot control the next decision. She opened a folder. At that point, she had 2 pieces of evidence: the email Daniel sent to the insurance agent, asking how quickly a spouse could receive money after a death certificate, and a request he made to our shared bank about access to accounts after a spouse died. That was enough to prove he was preparing. It was not enough to show how far he planned to go. Ruth reached into her bag and placed the office tablet on the blanket. His messages were still syncing, she said. Daniel had used the tablet months earlier to manage our shared calendar and never signed out of his account. Ruth had noticed the new messages only after his visit to the office. Claire read the thread in silence. Daniel had told Megan the house could be sold after a respectable waiting period. Megan complained that the greenhouse reduced the usable space in the yard. They argued over how much of the insurance money she should receive. There was no evidence Daniel had caused my illness or interfered with my treatment. Claire made that distinction clearly. What we have, she said, is proof that once you became sick, he preferred the outcome that benefited him. I told the doctors to give Daniel only the truth necessary for my care. The infection was responding, but the long-term treatment plan was still being evaluated. When I returned home, Daniel embraced me in front of the visiting nurse. Thank God, he whispered. For 1 second, my body responded from habit, My arms almost lifted around him. Then I remembered Megan's message. What if she recovers? I let my hands remain at my sides. His arms were warm. His face over my shoulder was empty. By day 6, Daniel had moved me into the downstairs guest room, saying the stairs were unsafe. Then he took over my home office to get our affairs in order. The next afternoon, while he was meeting with the broker, I entered the office. Inside the desk drawer was a spreadsheet dividing projected proceeds between Daniel and Megan. Beside the line for the house was a handwritten note. Wait 60 days, anything sooner looks bad. In another folder I found the revised power of attorney. It was no longer presented as a personal convenience. The new cover page described it as a continuity document designed to protect employees and keep payroll running if my condition worsened. That was cleverer. More believable. He was learning. Later that day, Megan arrived with a man she introduced as a landscape designer. We're just looking at options, she said. What options? For the yard. Dad thought it might help to know what repairs would cost. I watched them walk toward the greenhouse. The man measured the patio and pointed toward the eastern wall. If this structure came down, you could open the whole area up. Megan nodded. That's what I was thinking. I stood inside behind the hanging ferns, one hand resting on my mother's old potting table. Beneath the edge, her initials were still carved into the wood. Something inside me became very still. Protecting the insurance was not enough. Claire arranged an independent valuation of the company, protected its voting control, and created a fair path for Ruth and 2 longtime employees to buy in over time. The house remained protected under the prenuptial agreement with added safeguards against any unauthorized sale if I were ever incapacitated. That evening, Daniel announced the gathering. Friends, neighbors, church members, employees. He called it an evening of gratitude, a chance for people to speak while I was still strong enough to hear them. I looked at the man who had already priced my house and planned the timing of its sale. That sounds wonderful, I said. He wanted a room full of witnesses for his version of the story. On the 7th day of his countdown, I decided to let him gather them himself. The 7th morning began with a blood pressure reading high enough to make Denise, the visiting nurse, set down her clipboard and look at me over the top of her glasses. 164/92, she said. That is not a number I like. I'm having people over. You're having stress. That too. She checked the drainage site, changed the dressing, and reminded me that recovery did not mean I was suddenly well. My body still tired after a shower. My hand still shook when I lifted a cup. I understood the risk. What I did not have was another clean chance to stop Daniel from turning my illness into a public version of his own making. Whatever you're planning, Denise said, keep it short. I smiled. What makes you think I'm planning anything? She glanced toward the hallway where Daniel was giving instructions to a florist. I've been a nurse for 27 years. Claire arrived through the side entrance shortly after 8 with a mobile notary named Susan Bell. The bank confirmation had come through the night before. All that remained was documenting clearly and carefully that I understood every decision I was making. Ruth was already in the greenhouse pretending to repair a sticking irrigation valve. She kept watch through the side windows while Claire, Susan, and I gathered in my office. Susan did not rush. She asked me to explain each document in my own words. I told her the company had been mine before Daniel, that the house and greenhouse were protected by our prenuptial agreement, and that an independent valuation had been completed, so no lawful marital claim was hidden or reduced. I am not trying to leave my husband with nothing, I said. I am making sure he cannot take control of things he did not build. Susan studied my face. And the employee purchase options. Fair market terms. Ruth and the others are not being given the company. They are being given a fair path to buy into it. And the insurance trust? I have not finalized every distribution yet, but Daniel will not control it. She nodded and turned the page. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Daniel stopped outside the door. His hand settled on the knob and stayed there longer than necessary. Evelyn. I opened the door a few inches. He looked past me at Claire and Susan. What's going on? Claire is helping me update medical authorizations. And she is, a notary, Claire said. Hospitals and insurers prefer properly witnessed documents. His eyes moved from Claire to the folder on the desk. For 1 second, I thought he might ask to see it. Then the doorbell rang. The florist had arrived with another arrangement. Daniel smiled. Of course, he said. I just want today to be peaceful. So do I. He walked away. Susan completed the final stamp. My hand shook while I signed, but not from confusion. I knew exactly what each page meant. By noon, cars lined both sides of the street. Daniel had transformed the living room into something halfway between a celebration and a memorial. White lilies covered the mantel. Enlarged wedding photographs stood on easels. A slideshow played beside the fireplace, showing vacations, holiday dinners, and smiling poses taken from flattering angles. There was not one photograph from the years before Daniel. Nothing from my first office. Nothing of my mother in the greenhouse. Nothing from the period when I built the life he now claimed he was preparing to preserve. A guest book sat near the entrance beneath a framed card that read, "Words for Evelyn." The greenhouse remained locked. Daniel said it looked too cluttered for visitors. Pastor Lewis arrived with his wife. Neighbors filled the dining room. Several longtime employees came together, including 2 men who had worked for me before Daniel and I met. Ruth stood near the back wall, calm and watchful. Megan arrived late in a black dress that looked more suited to a memorial than an afternoon gathering. The broker came too. Daniel introduced him as an old family friend. The man looked uncomfortable when he saw me sitting upright, speaking clearly, and asking Denise whether I could have more ginger tea. Daniel guided him toward the drinks table before we could speak. At 1:30, Daniel tapped a spoon against his glass. The room quieted. He stood beside one of our wedding photographs and placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "The last week has reminded us how fragile life is. Evelyn has always been the strongest person I know, but even strong people reach a moment when they have to trust others to carry what they built." Several employees exchanged glances. Daniel continued. "She has asked me to protect the house, the company, and the people who depend on her. Megan and I intend to honor that responsibility." I had asked him no such thing. He reached for a folder on the table. "There is one simple continuity document Evelyn still needs to sign. It allows payroll and essential operations to continue if her condition changes." He had already tried to get my signature in private and failed. This time he had brought witnesses not because he wanted them to read the document, but because he believed I would be too embarrassed to refuse in front of employees whose paychecks he claimed were at risk. If I signed, the room would remember it as consent. If I refused, he could blame the medication. He carried the folder to me. "Just the signature page," he said softly. Yellow tabs covered several sections. I removed the first one, then the second. The language beneath them gave Daniel broad authority over company banking insurance communications and financial decisions. "No," I said. His smile did not move. "Evelyn, this only keeps your employees safe." "My employees are already protected." The room shifted. Daniel lowered his voice. "We discussed this." "You discussed it. I declined." He turned toward the guests with a sorrowful expression. "The medication makes her confused sometimes." That was the sentence Claire had warned me about. I set the folder on the table. "I'm clear enough to remember you smiling in the hospital parking lot." No one moved. Daniel's face tightened. "You were half asleep." "I was awake when you looked at your watch and said, 7 days. I was awake when you told Megan not to do anything until there was a death certificate." Megan went pale. Daniel laughed once too sharply. "That is not what happened." Ruth stepped forward. "You asked me how fast the company could be sold." The broker looked at Daniel. "You told me Mrs. Carter had already agreed to list the property." "I never authorized a listing," I said. Daniel raised both hands. "I was preparing for the worst." "No," I said. "You were preparing for the best, for you." Claire opened her folder. She placed Daniel's email to the insurance agent on the table. Then the proposed home listing. Then the continuity document he had just tried to make me sign. Nothing more. His own words were enough. Daniel looked around the room for support and found none. Then I told them the truth. "I am not terminal. The biopsy found no cancer. The infection is treatable." Silence settled over the room. For one heartbeat, Daniel said nothing. Then the question escaped him. "What did you do with the insurance policy?" The room changed after that. No one needed Claire to explain what his question meant. "I changed the beneficiary a month before you started counting my days," I said. His face lost all color. "But the insurance was only the first thing I changed. I did not make a speech about revenge. I had no interest in turning my living room into a courtroom or asking anyone to applaud while my marriage collapsed. I told them only what mattered. Daniel would receive exactly what the law and our prenuptial agreement allowed. The company would remain protected with a fair purchase path for Ruth and 2 longtime employees who had helped build it. The house and greenhouse would stay mine. The insurance trust would support my niece, help stabilize the company during the ownership transition, and fund a new program for women rebuilding their lives in midlife. Daniel stared at me as though I had spoken in another language. You did all of this while I was taking care of you. The question might have sounded wounded if I had not seen the document he wanted me to sign. You were taking care of the version of me who couldn't stop you. His mouth tightened. Megan stood near the fireplace with her arms folded across her black dress. For the first time that afternoon, she looked less angry than frightened. So none of us were ever family to you. I remembered sitting beside her at her mother's funeral. I remembered paying part of her tuition, co-signing a loan for her boutique, and answering late-night calls when she needed someone only to watch her disappear whenever she did not. I treated you like family, I said. You treated me like an estate. Her face changed. Dad said you were giving everything away? Your father never built that company. Daniel stepped between us. This is exactly what Claire wanted. She turned you against us. Claire said nothing. She did not need to. I looked at Daniel. No one turned me against you. You did that yourself. He glanced around the room. Pastor Lewis lowered his eyes. The broker stood stiffly near the window. Several employees had moved closer to Ruth. No one spoke for him. You humiliated me, Daniel said. I did not invite these people here to watch you say goodbye to me. You did. His expression shifted then. The anger disappeared, replaced by calculation. I recognized the moment he realized the room was no longer useful to him. He reached for his jacket. Megan, we're leaving. She hesitated. What about my things? Now. They walked out together. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the wedding photograph on the nearest easel. One of the lilies tipped from its vase and fell onto the floor. No one laughed. No one cheered. For several seconds, the room held only the soft hum of the slideshow projector. Then Pastor Lewis crossed the room and turned it off. The gathering ended quietly. Neighbors carried food into the kitchen. Employees asked whether payroll was safe. The broker apologized and offered to forward every email Daniel had sent him. Ruth unlocked the greenhouse before the last guest left. That evening, after Claire gathered the documents and Denise checked my blood pressure again, I sat alone at my mother's potting table. The glass panels reflected the lights from the house. My body ached. My hands trembled from exhaustion. I had protected the company and the house, but I did not feel victorious. I slipped my wedding ring from my finger and set it on the table. For a moment I could not let go of it. That ring had belonged to the man who warmed my car on cold mornings, sat beside me through fevers, and knew how I took my coffee. It also belonged to the man who had looked at his watch and counted down to my death. I closed my hand around it once, then opened my fingers. The ring stayed where it was. Real life did not become easy when Daniel walked out. Within 48 hours, he hired an attorney and claimed I had been manipulated while sick. He asked the court to freeze changes involving the company. He argued that Claire and Ruth had isolated me, that medication had impaired my judgment, and that I had acted out of fear after a frightening diagnosis. Claire had prepared for that. The medical records showed I was alert and competent. Dr. Hall submitted a written statement. Susan's notes documented that I had explained every decision in my own words. The prenuptial agreement and independent valuation showed that no assets had been hidden or transferred below market value. The court denied Daniel's request to freeze the company. The divorce took 4 months. There were depositions, phone calls, and envelopes filled with language designed to make cruelty sound administrative. Daniel received the portion of marital property he was legally owed. He did not receive the insurance, the company, or my house. The $42,000 in hidden debt remained his responsibility after the records showed he had concealed the accounts and used them for his own transactions. At the final settlement meeting, he sat across from me in a conference room downtown. He looked older than he had in the hospital parking lot. Before he signed, he asked, "Did you ever love me?" I thought about the coffee he used to make the winter mornings when he warmed my car, and the years I spent explaining away the things that did not fit. I loved the man I believed you were. He looked down and signed. Megan contacted me 2 months later. She said Daniel had pressured her. She said she had been scared about money and believed I intended to leave them with nothing. She wrote that she was sorry I had been hurt, which was not the same as saying she was sorry for what she had done. I told her she was 34 years old and responsible for her choices. I did not close the door permanently, but I removed money from the doorway. No loans, no checks, no relationship built around what she might inherit. She did not reply. My surgery went well. Recovery did not happen in a clean upward line. Some mornings I felt almost normal. Other days, walking from the kitchen to the greenhouse left me exhausted. Ruth kept the company steady while I healed. When the time came to discuss ownership, she refused special treatment. If I buy in, she said, I pay a fair price. That is exactly why I want you there. We structured the purchase carefully. A year later, the greenhouse looked different. We repaired the glass, replaced the broken irrigation lines, and arranged folding chairs around my mother's old table. Once a month, women in their 50s and 60s came there to learn how to build a budget register, a small business, apply for a loan, or begin again after the life they expected had fallen apart. On the anniversary of Daniel's gathering, I stood near the eastern windows while morning light spread across the floor. 12 women leaned over notebooks, asking practical questions in careful voices. I looked at the clock once. Then I turned it toward the wall. Around my mother's table, those women were making plans for lives no one else would control. Ruth handed me a pen. I pulled out a chair and joined them. Daniel had counted 7 days until he believed my life would belong to him. A year later, I was still here building what came next. Which moment stayed with you most? Tell me in the comments and subscribe for more stories about starting over.